So the tentative title of my paper right now is Winning Without Enforcement, Rethinking Judicial Success in International Human Rights Law and How Strategic Litigation Can Achieve It. And in my paper, I basically use a recent Japanese court case commonly referred to as Paradise on Earth to examine a central tension in international human rights law, that being, while courts may be able to recognize human rights violations, they often lack the power necessary to enforce their rulings, especially against uncooperative states. And the Paradise on Earth suit actually illustrates this problem pretty well, so I think I'm just going to jump right in. So going back for a little history lesson here, beginning in the late 1950s, North Korea, along with support from organizations in Japan, promoted a migration program targeting ethnic Koreans living in Japan, and many of these individuals already faced severe discrimination and economic hardship in Japan, so they were really excited to take part in this program after North Korea advertised it as an opportunity to, quote-unquote, return to their prosperous socialist homeland where housing, food, and jobs would be guaranteed. But in reality, the program functioned as a trap. Once participants arrived in North Korea, they were effectively prevented from leaving. They were assigned to the lowest social class, subjected to forced labor and constant surveillance. Many lived in extreme poverty, and they were forced to watch others around them starve, disappear, or even die. And this was the reality for Iko Kawasaki, who spent over 40 years in North Korea due to this program, before finally escaping in 2003. In 2018, she and 4 other escaping survivors sued North Korea in Japanese court for violating a myriad of human rights, including the right to work, the right to self-determination regarding where and how one lives, one's freedom of movement, and the right to expression. And after years of litigation, the court ruled finally in 2026 in their favor and awarded damages. But nevertheless, there is still a problem, as North Korea never appeared in court, and the plaintiffs will likely never see a cent. So, using that case as a lens, I asked 2 related questions. First, what counts as judicial success in international human rights law? And second, how can litigation be used strategically to achieve it? My argument is twofold. First, that judicial success is best understood through a constructivist lens, which includes a decision's indirect or symbolic impacts on social change. And then second, I argue that litigation can be used strategically to produce those outcomes, particularly where litigators are deliberate about ensuring that their client is the right one to bring the case, how the story is framed, and when the case is brought. So to develop all of this, I take a couple steps. First, I look at the 2 main ways that scholars define judicial success in international human rights law, this being the neo-realist perspective and the constructivist approach. And then I also compare how Paradise would measure in terms of success underneath both approaches, just to further show their differences. Then I turn to scholarship and surveys on plaintiffs' motivations behind seeking litigation to determine which approach better aligns with those motivations and thus is the more appropriate standard for judicial success. And I ultimately find that the constructivist approach better aligns, but I'll talk about that more later. So after determining that the constructivist approach is the proper measurement of judicial success, I then shift gears to explore how litigation can be used strategically to achieve these kinds of successes that the constructivist approach allows for, and I rely on a toolkit published by the Digital Freedom Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that exists to advance human rights in digital spaces. So, lastly, and then I have a conclusion paragraph that's just key takeaways. Now I can just get into my findings. So what is judicial success? On the first question, that answer depends on the framework in which you employ. Under a neo-realist approach, success is determined to the extent a court's ruling produces an observable material change in the conduct of the targeted actor. And in the international human rights context, that obviously is a very demanding standard because courts often lack a lot of enforcement aids that are necessary to do so, such as a binding piece of legislation. So a lot of uncooperative states just don't have to comply. And applied here, that framework would definitely treat the Paradise on Earth lawsuit as a failure because it is unlikely that North Korea will pay a single cent or immediately cease any sort of misconduct. But Paradise has some hope underneath the constructivist approach because underneath that approach, court decisions are seen as much more capable of influencing social change, making their definition extend more broadly to include a decision's indirect and symbolic effects on society. So examples of this could include a ruling's positive impact on the public's understanding of an issue, its capacity to mobilize or consolidate activist groups, its role in generating media coverage, and its ability to reframe an issue as a human rights violation. And when we apply that framework to Paradise, the case can be understood as successful even without its enforcement. It reframed the Paradise on Earth program as a human rights violation when it was previously seen as a utopia to some. It generated widespread media coverage, amplifying the voices of victims who had been silenced for decades due to the censorship, and it generated a lot of political and social pressure on both North Korea and Japan to stop their discriminatory practices. So, we obviously have different results underneath both frameworks. Which one wins? Well, my paper examines surveys and legal scholarship on what people seeking suits actually want out of their litigation to determine which definition of success more aligns with their goals. And the research shows something important. People generally don't go to court just for the ruling or money, but across all different types of cases, but especially those involving dignity harms like discrimination or violence, plaintiffs often care just as much or even more about things like recognition, validation, and being heard. And that pattern shows up clearly in the Paradise case. I mean, those plaintiffs knew they would never likely receive any money from North Korea, but they still described the ruling as a full victory that day in 2026. And this is because they did not care about the compensation. I mean, they did, but they more so cared about the court wanting to validate their experiences, amplify their voices, and reframe the Paradise narrative as a human rights violation. And that's exactly what the litigation achieved. So a near-realist disregard of these effects can't be the correct definition of judicial success when it's probably what these Paradise plaintiffs and a lot of others were primarily seeking. And that's why the constructivist framework provides a better definition of judicial success. So then my paper turns to how can litigation achieve this kind of success? And that's where strategic litigation comes in, which is all about deliberately designing a case to maximize its impact, not just legally, but socially. And this section focuses on 3 strategic levers that lawyers can employ to achieve strategic litigation and to maximize a case's impact. First, that being the identity and number of the claimants, because who brings the case matters. A strong, credible plaintiff can give a human face to the harm and make the issue more compelling. And when you put multiple plaintiffs together, it can help frame the case as a broader pattern of serious misconduct rather than an isolated incident. And we see this in the Paradise on Earth case, as all 5 plaintiffs shared powerful, consistent accounts of their experiences, which made the harms more tangible and strengthened the credibility of the claims. The second strategy has all to do with storytelling, basically just making sure that you are using all actors available to help push the story that you want to tell to both those in the courtroom, but also at the media at large. In fact, sometimes you can even use your opponent's voice to tell your story. This actually happened in the Paradise case when North Korea refused to participate because it actually strengthened the plaintiff's narrative. It reinforced perceptions of wrongdoing and showed their lack of accountability, which increased public attention and support for the plaintiffs. My last one will have to do with timing because when you bring a case, it's just as important as how you bring it, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to delve into that. So as for my limits, I really think my biggest one actually is my strategies. So if any of you guys have any ideas, that is what I would really like to know. Anyways, thanks for listening.